Mary Dugan buried her mother on a gray Kansas morning in 1868, and it was there, standing over the fresh mound of turned earth with her father's hand trembling on her shoulder, that she made a promise to herself she intended to keep for the rest of her life. She would never, under any circumstance, give her heart to a cowboy. The promise was not born of foolishness. It was born of watching her mother waste away from grief after Mary's father, Thomas Dugan, had trusted his business partner, a smooth-talking cattleman named Jed Calloway, with nearly every dollar the family owned. Calloway had ridden into their lives with an easy laugh and a silver tongue, promising Thomas a share in a cattle drive that would make them both rich men. He had taken the money, the wagon, and two of their best horses, and disappeared into the Texas dust, never to be seen again. Thomas Dugan had spent the rest of his days behind the counter of a dry goods store in Abilene, a broken man trying to rebuild what a cowboy's lies had taken from him, and Mary's mother had simply stopped eating, stopped smiling, and eventually stopped breathing altogether, worn down by shame and heartbreak until there was nothing left of her. Mary was only 14 when she watched them lower her mother into the ground, but she was old enough to understand exactly what had killed her, and old enough to swear that no man with a saddle and a horse and a hat pulled low over his eyes would ever again make a fool of anyone she loved. 10 years passed, and Mary Dugan grew into a woman known throughout Dickinson County for her sharp tongue, her steady hands with a needle, and her unshakable resolve. She had cared for her father until his own death from a fever in the spring of 1878, and when the lawyer in town read her the letter informing her that her Aunt Sarah Dugan Whitcomb had passed away in the Wyoming Territory and left her a modest homestead along a place called Cottonwood Creek, Mary saw it not as tragedy but as opportunity. She was 24 years old, unmarried, with no family left to speak of, and no reason at all to stay in Kansas among memories that had long since gone bitter. She packed 2 trunks, sold what furniture she could not carry, and boarded a train west, determined to build a life of her own where no man, cowboy or otherwise, would ever again have the chance to ruin it. The train carried her as far as Cheyenne, and from there she took a stagecoach north toward the small settlement of Prairie Bend, a cluster of clapboard buildings and dust-blown streets that sat where the high plains met the first rolling foothills of the mountains. It was late summer, the grass gone gold and brittle, the sky a hard, endless blue that seemed to Mary entirely too large for the small woman riding beneath it. The stagecoach carried 4 passengers besides herself, a traveling preacher with a Bible worn soft at the corners, a portly cattle buyer who smelled of cigars, and an elderly married couple bound for a homestead near the Platte. They had been riding since dawn when the storm rolled in from the west, sudden and violent the way storms often are on the high plains, turning the sky the color of a bruise and driving rain sideways across the trail until the driver could barely see the horses in front of him. It was the storm that broke the axle. The coach lurched hard to the left with a crack like a rifle shot, and Mary was thrown against the window frame hard enough to bruise her shoulder. The driver, a grizzled man named Otis who had been hauling passengers across that stretch of territory for the better part of a decade, climbed down into the mud and rain to survey the damage, and returned a few minutes later soaked to the bone and shaking his head. "Axles snapped clean through," he said. "We are not going anywhere tonight, folks. Not on this road, not in this weather." The preacher prayed. The cattle buyer swore under his breath and then apologized for it. The elderly woman began to weep quietly, worried for her husband's rheumatism in the cold and wet, and Mary Dugan, soaked through her traveling dress and furious at the delay, climbed down from the coach herself to see the damage with her own eyes, because she had never in her life been the sort of woman to simply sit and wait for someone else to solve her problems. It was in that moment, standing in the mud beside the crippled stagecoach with rain running down her collar, that she first saw Walter Merritt. He came riding out of the storm like something conjured from it, a broad-shouldered man on a rangy bay gelding, his hat brim low against the rain, trailing a small string of cattle he had clearly been driving toward some distant pasture before the weather turned. He reined up sharp when he saw the stranded coach, and Mary watched him take in the scene with quick, careful eyes before he swung down from the saddle. "Looks like you folks have had some trouble," he said, and his voice was low and even without the false charm she had learned to distrust in men like him. "We have had considerable trouble," Otis said, wringing water from his hat. "Axles broke. We are still 8 miles from Prairie Bend, and it will be dark within the hour." Walter Merritt looked past the driver to where Mary stood, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her chin lifted in a way that dared him to say something foolish. He touched the brim of his hat toward her, a small courtesy, nothing more. "Ma'am," he said. "Sir," Mary answered, and nothing more. He turned back to Otis. "There is a line shack about a mile east of here. Belongs to the Bar M. It will keep the worst of this off you until morning, and I can ride ahead and bring back a wagon for the rest of you and your baggage. It is not much, but it is dry." The cattle buyer looked relieved. The preacher thanked God aloud. The elderly couple simply nodded, too tired and cold to argue. Mary, however, studied Walter Merritt with the same suspicion she might have given a snake coiled in tall grass. "And why," she asked, "would a stranger go to such trouble for people he has never met?" Walter's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more the shadow of one. "Because it is going to storm harder before it storms less, ma'am, and I would not leave a dog out in this, let alone good people. Besides, the Bar M owes hospitality to anyone caught in weather like this. It is simply how things are done out here." "That is what I was raised to never trust," Mary said, before she could stop herself. A cowboy with an easy answer for everything. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or amusement, but he did not argue with her. He only nodded slowly, as though her words were a fact of the landscape he had long since learned to accept, like the wind or the cold. "I reckon you have your reasons, ma'am. I will not ask you to trust me. I will only ask you to get out of the rain." He helped Otis and the cattle buyer maneuver the injured coach off the muddy trail, and he offered the elderly woman his own saddle blanket to keep the worst of the rain off her shoulders as they walked the short distance to the line shack. He did not offer his arm to Mary, did not press himself upon her in any way, simply walked his horse alongside the small group of stranded travelers with the quiet patience of a man used to difficult weather and difficult company alike. The line shack was small and rough, a single room with a stone fireplace and a dirt floor, but it was dry, and within a half-hour Walter Merritt had a fire crackling and had produced, from his saddlebags, a tin of coffee and a small sack of hardtack that he shared without hesitation among the 6 of them. "You are not from around here," he said to Mary, as the others settled near the fire and the preacher began quietly to doze. "No," she said. "I am from Kansas. I have come to claim my aunt's homestead along Cottonwood Creek." "Sarah Whitcomb," Walter said, and something gentled in his face. "I knew her a little. She was a fine woman, sharp-tongued but fine. She used to bring pies to the Grange Hall suppers that made grown men weep." Mary felt something twist in her chest at hearing her aunt spoken of so warmly by a stranger, and she was not certain if it was grief or something else entirely. "You knew her," she repeated. "Everyone in Prairie Bend knew her, ma'am. It is a small town. Everyone knows everyone sooner or later, for better or worse." He paused, studying the fire. "I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Mary said stiffly, and turned her face toward the flames so he would not see how close she came, in that moment, to weeping. They did not speak again that night beyond the necessary courtesies, and in the morning Walter rode the mile back to the Bar M ranch and returned with a wagon and 2 hired hands to carry the stranded passengers and their baggage the rest of the way into Prairie Bend. He delivered Mary and her 2 trunks to the boarding house, run by a widow named Hattie Sullivan, tipped his hat once more, and rode off toward his cattle without another word, and Mary told herself she was glad of it. She told herself the same thing for nearly 2 weeks, though it became progressively harder to believe. Prairie Bend, Wyoming Territory, in the late summer of 1878, was a town of perhaps 300 souls, strung out along a single dusty main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a small church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the west from the prevailing winds, a saloon that also served as the only hotel, and a scattering of houses that thinned out into homesteads and ranches as the land climbed toward the foothills. It was not a large place, but it was a determined one, full of people who had come west for their own reasons and stayed because the land, however hard, had a way of becoming home. Mary's aunt's homestead sat 4 miles outside of town along Cottonwood Creek, a modest cabin with a sod roof, a small barn in need of considerable repair, and a stretch of pasture that ran down to the water. It was not much, but it was hers, free and clear, and Mary Dugan walked the boundaries of it on her first morning there with a fierce and possessive pride she had not expected to feel. She quickly discovered, however, that a homestead required more labor than one woman alone could easily provide. The barn roof had partially collapsed over the winter, the fence posts along the north pasture had rotted through, and the well-needed clearing before the water could be trusted for drinking. Hattie Sullivan, the widow who ran the boarding house and who had taken an immediate liking to Mary's sharp wit, suggested she hire help from among the local ranch hands. "There is no shame in it," Hattie said, over tea in her kitchen. "Everyone hires help out here, dear. The land does not care whether you are a man or a woman. It only cares whether the work gets done." "I would rather do it myself," Mary said, "than owe anyone a debt I cannot repay." "You would pay them, Mary, same as anyone." "That is not a debt, that is business." Mary considered this and decided, against every instinct her upbringing had given her, that Hattie was probably right. She asked in town for recommendations, and more than one person mentioned the same name: Walter Merritt, foreman of the Bar M, known throughout the county as an honest man and a hard worker, the sort who would fix a fence for a widow and refuse extra payment for the trouble. Mary's stomach dropped unpleasantly at the name, though she could not have said at the time exactly why. She sent word through the general store, and 2 days later Walter Merritt rode up to her homestead on the same rangy bay gelding, dismounted, and stood looking at her collapsed barn roof with his hands on his hips and a low whistle escaping his lips. "That is going to take some doing," he said. "I'm prepared to pay a fair wage," Mary said, before he could offer anything for free. Walter looked at her, and there was something almost like humor in his eyes, though his face stayed solemn. "I would not dream of doing otherwise, ma'am. A fair wage it is." He worked through the better part of 2 weeks, coming in the mornings before the day's ranch work called him back to the Bar M, and Mary watched him from the cabin window more often than she liked to admit, watched the easy, economical way he moved, hauling timber and mending fence without wasted motion or complaint, always polite, always careful to address her as ma'am, never once presuming a familiarity she had not offered. It was, she found, considerably harder to hate a man who did exactly as he said he would do, for exactly the price he had named, and asked for nothing more. Still, she kept her guard raised. She brought him water at midday because it seemed the decent thing to do, and no more. She paid him promptly, in full, and thanked him with careful formality. When he complimented the coffee she brought out to him, she informed him crisply that she had learned to make it strong because weak coffee was an insult to hard-working men, and then retreated to the cabin before he could say anything further. "You keep a man at arm's length awful well, Miss Dugan," Hattie observed one afternoon, when she had ridden out to see how the repairs progressed. "Most women in this territory would be glad of a man like Walter Merritt sniffing around their homestead." "He is not sniffing around anything," Mary said. "He is repairing a barn," said Hattie, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the sort, and said nothing further on the subject that day. The barn was repaired by the 2nd week of September, the fences mended, the well cleared, and Walter Merritt, having finished the work he had been hired to do, tipped his hat to Mary one final time and told her that if she ever had further need, the Bar M was only a few miles distant and she had only to send word. Mary thanked him, paid him the last of his wage, and told herself she was glad to see the back of him. She was considerably less glad than she expected to be. It was perhaps 3 weeks later, in early October, that Prairie Bend held its harvest supper at the Grange Hall, an annual tradition that drew ranchers and homesteaders from 30 miles in every direction for an evening of food, music, and the kind of gossip that could only flourish in a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Hattie insisted that Mary attend, informing her in no uncertain terms that a young woman new to the territory could not simply hide away on her homestead forever, and Mary, having no good argument against this logic, allowed herself to be persuaded. The Grange Hall was strung with paper lanterns and crowded with long tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and pies of every description, and a small band of local musicians had set up in the corner with a fiddle, a guitar, and an accordion that wheezed more than it played, but did so cheerfully. Mary wore her best dress, a deep green wool that Hattie declared brought out the color of her eyes, and found herself, despite her reservations, enjoying the warmth and noise of the gathering. She was standing near the punch table speaking with a rancher's wife about the price of wool when Walter Merritt approached, hat in hand, his dark hair damp from an evident attempt to tame it for the occasion. "Miss Dugan," he said, "you are looking well." "Mr. Merritt," she said, with the polite coolness she had cultivated as her only defense against him, "I did not expect to see you here. Everyone in 3 counties is here, ma'am. I would be a strange sort of neighbor if I stayed away." He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands, an unusual nervousness in a man she had only ever seen calm and steady. "I was wondering if you might do me the honor of a dance, if you are willing." Mary opened her mouth to refuse, the old warning rising automatically to her lips, but something in his face, some careful hopefulness he was trying and failing to hide, made the refusal die before she spoke it. "One dance," she said instead, "for your trouble with the barn." "I would have thought I was already paid for the barn," Walter said, and there was that almost smile again. "Consider it interest," Mary said, and allowed him to lead her onto the floor as the fiddle struck up a reel. He danced well, better than she expected, with none of the clumsy stumbling she associated with men who spent most of their lives on horseback rather than ballroom floors. And for the length of that one dance, Mary Dugan found herself laughing, genuinely and without reservation, at something he said about a particularly stubborn bull on the Bar M that had once chased him clear into the creek. When the song ended, she stepped back, flushed and a little breathless, and found him watching her with an expression she did not have a name for, something warm and quiet and entirely too dangerous for a woman who had sworn off cowboys at her mother's grave. "Thank you for the dance, Mr. Merritt," she said. "Walter," he said, "if you would not mind. Mr. Merritt makes me sound like my father, and he was a hard man to live up to." "Walter," Mary repeated, testing the shape of his name in her mouth, and found she did not entirely dislike it. She did not dance with him again that night, mindful of the whispers such a thing might generate, but she found her eyes drifting toward him more than once across the crowded hall, and she noticed, with some irritation at herself, that she was disappointed when he finally took his leave. The weeks that followed brought Walter Merritt into her life with increasing, if always proper, regularity. He rode by the homestead on his way to check the Bar M's northern pastures and stopped to inquire after her well-being. He brought her a jar of honey from a hive he had found in a hollow cottonwood, insisting it was simply too much for one bachelor to use alone. He fixed her gate latch without being asked when he noticed it hanging loose, and refused payment so firmly that Mary finally gave up offering it. And slowly, despite every instinct her upbringing had instilled in her, Mary Dugan found herself looking forward to the sight of his bay gelding coming up the trail toward her cabin. It was in November, with the first hard frost silvering the grass, that Mary finally asked him the question that had been sitting on her tongue for weeks. They were sitting on the small porch of her cabin, sharing a pot of coffee as the sun set behind the foothills in a wash of orange and violet, when she set down her cup and looked at him directly. "Why do you do it, Walter? The favors, the visits, the honey and the gate latch. What is it you want from me?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon rather than her face. "I suppose I could tell you it is neighborly kindness," he said finally, "and it would not be entirely a lie. But I think you would see through it, Miss Dugan, because I think you see through most things. Then tell me the truth." He turned to look at her then, and there was nothing of the easy charm she had once feared in his expression, only a plain and careful honesty. "The truth is that I have never met a woman who argued with me about accepting kindness the way you do, and I have never wanted, quite so much, to keep finding reasons to see her again. I do not know what that means exactly, not yet. But I did not want to lie to you about it, because I suspect you have had enough lies from men to last a lifetime." Mary's chest tightened, and she looked away toward the creek running dark and silver in the last of the light. "I was raised to never trust a cowboy," she said quietly. "My father trusted one once and it cost him everything. His money, his pride, my mother's health, and eventually her life. I swore at her grave that I would never make the same mistake." "I am sorry," Walter said, and he did not offer excuses for the man who had wronged her, did not try to argue her out of her grief. "That is not a small thing to carry." "No," Mary agreed, "it is not. I cannot undo what was done to your family, Mary. I would not know how to try. But I can tell you that I have never taken a dollar I did not earn, nor made a promise I did not intend to keep, and I do not intend to start now with you." He paused. "I know that is easy to say and harder to prove. I am willing to spend as much time as it takes proving it if you will let me." Mary looked at him for a long moment, at the honest, weather-worn face, the careful hands wrapped around a tin coffee cup, the steady patience in his eyes, and felt the wall she had built so carefully around her heart begin, for the first time in 10 years, to show a crack. "I am not promising anything," she said. "I am not asking you to," Walter said. "Not yet." Winter came hard to the high plains that year, burying Prairie Bend under drifts that closed the roads for days at a time, and Mary spent the coldest months managing her homestead with the help of a hired hand named young Silas, a boy of 17 from a neighboring family who split wood, and tended her small herd of cattle in exchange for meals and a modest wage. But Walter found reasons to visit even through the snow, arriving with his horse's breath fogging in the cold air, bringing news from town, checking that her chimney drew properly, and staying to share supper more evenings than either of them ever formally arranged. It was during that long winter that Mary learned the fuller shape of Walter Merritt's own history, and found it more complicated and more sympathetic than she had expected. His father, Elias Merritt, had run a modest cattle operation in Texas before the war, and had lost nearly everything to a crooked banker who called in loans the moment the market turned against small ranchers, seizing land that had taken 2 generations to build. Elias had died not long after, worn down by the loss much as Mary's own mother had been, and Walter, only 19 at the time, had drifted north and west through a string of ranch jobs before finally settling at the Bar M under Old Man Merritt's distant cousin, who had given him steady work, and eventually the position of foreman. "I know what it is to watch someone you love broken by another man's dishonesty," Walter told her one evening, as snow ticked softly against the cabin window. "I do not blame you for your caution, Mary. I only hope, in time, you will see that not every man wearing a hat and spurs is cut from the same cloth as the ones who hurt you and your father." "I am beginning to see it," Mary admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "Slowly. Slowly is fine," Walter said. "I am not in any particular hurry." Spring returned to the territory in April, thawing the creek and greening the pastures, and with it came trouble that Mary had not anticipated. A wealthy cattleman named Bartholomew Whitfield, who owned the largest ranch in the county, and had long coveted the water rights along Cottonwood Creek that ran through Mary's aunt's old property, began paying Mary visits of his own, arriving in a fine buggy with an expensive coat and an oiled mustache, offering to buy her homestead outright for what he assured her was a generous price. A woman alone should not be burdened with the labor of a working ranch, Whitfield told her, on his second visit, seated stiffly in her small cabin with his hat balanced on his knee. I would be doing you a kindness, Miss Dugan, taking this land off your hands. You could live comfortably in town on the proceeds, perhaps even return east if you found the territory too rough for a lady of your refinement. I find the territory suits me well enough, Mary said coolly. And I have no intention of selling. Whitfield's smile thinned but did not disappear entirely. The offer will remain open, of course. Though I would caution you, Miss Dugan, that homesteads such as yours face all manner of difficulty. Fences fall, cattle wander, fires start from careless sparks. A woman alone cannot always guard against such misfortunes. The threat, thinly veiled as it was, sent a chill through Mary that had nothing to do with the spring evening. She reported the visit to Walter the next time he came by, and watched his jaw tighten in a way she had not seen before. Whitfield has wanted that water access since before your aunt passed, Walter said. Sarah Whitcomb refused him 3 times that I know of, and he never took kindly to it. I do not like the sound of what he said to you, Mary. Not one bit. You think he means to make trouble. I think a man used to getting what he wants does not simply accept no for an answer and go home satisfied, Walter said grimly. I will speak to the sheriff, though there is little he can do until something actually happens. In the meantime, I want you to send for me, day or night, if you see anything out of the ordinary. Anything at all. Mary, who had spent so long insisting she needed no man's protection, found herself, for the first time, grateful beyond words that Walter Merritt had made himself so steadily, patiently present in her life. The trouble came 3 weeks later, on a moonless night in early May. Mary woke to the smell of smoke and the frantic bawling of cattle, and stumbled from her bed to find the small barn ablaze, flames licking hungrily up the freshly repaired timber, throwing wild orange light across the yard. Young Silas, sleeping in the loft that night to watch a sick calf, came scrambling out coughing and half-blind from smoke, and together they managed to drive the terrified cattle clear of the burning structure. But the barn itself, along with the winter's stored hay, was beyond saving. Mary sent Silas running for help on her fastest horse, while she worked the well pump herself, hauling bucket after bucket toward the blaze in a desperate effort to keep the fire from spreading to the cabin, her hands blistering, her lungs burning with smoke, until she thought her arms would simply give out beneath her. It was Walter who arrived first, riding hard through the darkness with 2 other Bar M hands close behind, having seen the glow of the fire from miles off and needing no further explanation to know where it led. He threw himself from his horse before it had fully stopped and took the bucket from Mary's raw hands. "Get back," he ordered, not unkindly but with absolute firmness. "Let us handle this." "It is my barn," Mary said, refusing to move. "And I am not about to lose you along with it," Walter said, and something in his voice, rough with fear and urgency, stopped her cold. "Please, Mary." She retreated to the well pump instead, working it as fast as her exhausted arms allowed, while Walter and the 2 hands formed a bucket line. And within another hour, with the arrival of neighbors drawn by the smoke and glow visible for miles across the flat plains, the fire was finally contained to the barn alone, sparing both the cabin and the surrounding grass from the same fate. By dawn, the barn was a smoking ruin, but Mary Dugan, her cattle safe in the pasture and her cabin untouched, stood in the gray morning light with Walter Merritt beside her, both of them soot-streaked and exhausted, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity how close she had come to losing everything. "This was no accident," Walter said quietly, examining the char at the base of the ruined structure. "Someone set this deliberately. I can see the pattern of it right here, where the fire started low and outside the walls rather than from a lantern or a spark inside." "Whitfield," Mary said, her voice tight with fury rather than fear. "I cannot prove it," Walter said. "Not yet." but I intend to try." The sheriff, a weathered man named Coburn who had little patience for wealthy cattlemen throwing their weight around, rode out that same morning to examine the damage himself, and found, tangled in the brush near the creek not far from the ruined barn, a distinctive silver spur that several townsfolk later confirmed belonged to one of Whitfield's own hired riders, a man known locally for his willingness to do unsavory work for good pay. It was not, by itself, enough evidence to hang a man, but it was enough to force a reckoning. Sheriff Coburn rode out to the Whitfield ranch with Walter Merritt at his side, and Mary, against every instruction to remain safely at home, insisted on accompanying them, her chin lifted in the same defiant way it had been lifted the first day Walter met her in the rain. Bartholomew Whitfield received them on the wide porch of his ranch house, his expensive coat immaculate, his composure only slightly ruffled by the sight of the sheriff's badge. "I'm not certain what this is about," Whitfield said smoothly, "but I assure you, Sheriff, I know nothing of any fire." "This spur was found near the scene," Coburn said, holding it up. "It is a fine piece of silver work, distinctive enough that 3 different men in town have already told me it belongs to your rider, Amos Kettle." Whitfield's composure flickered just slightly before he recovered it. "If Kettle was involved in something untoward, it was without my knowledge or my sanction. I will discharge him at once, if that satisfies you." "It does not satisfy me," Mary said, stepping forward before either man could stop her, her voice shaking with fury but her spine straight as a fence post. "You threatened me yourself, Mr. Whitfield, not 3 weeks past. You spoke of fires and fallen fences as though warning me of what was to come." "I have witnesses to that conversation, if it comes to it." Whitfield's face darkened. "I warned you of the dangers of a woman managing property alone, Miss Dugan. Nothing more." "You will leave her be," Walter said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Mary had never heard from him before, "or I will make certain every rancher and buyer from here to Cheyenne knows exactly what kind of man you are, and exactly what you did to a woman with no husband and no brothers to defend her honor. You may have money, Whitfield, but money does not buy back a ruined reputation, not in a territory this small." The threat, delivered with quiet, absolute conviction, seemed to land harder than any legal accusation could have. Whitfield's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I have no further interest in Miss Dugan's homestead," he said stiffly. "You may consider the matter closed, Sheriff, and I trust we need not speak of it again." They rode away from the Whitfield ranch in silence, and it was not until they had put several miles between themselves and the great house that Mary finally let out a long, shaking breath and allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall freely. "Could have burned the cabin too," she said, her voice breaking. "He could have killed Silas or me and no one would have proven a thing." Walter reined his horse close beside hers and reached across the distance between them to take her hand, his grip warm and steady around her trembling fingers. "He did not," Walter said gently. "You are safe, Mary. Your homestead still stands, and I promise you I will not let a man like Whitfield or any man hurt you while I have breath left to prevent it." Mary looked at him then, really looked at him, at the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, the exhaustion of a sleepless night still etched into his face, the gentleness of his hand around hers despite the anger he had shown Whitfield only minutes before, and felt something inside her that had been guarded and locked away for 10 long years finally, quietly break open. "I have been a fool," she said softly. "You have been careful," Walter corrected her. "There is a difference." "I told you I was raised to never trust a cowboy," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you have shown me, over and over, that trust is not owed to a hat and a pair of spurs, nor withheld from them either. It is owed to the man wearing them and what he does with the trust he is given." "And what have I done with it?" Walter asked quietly. "You have earned it," Mary said. "Every single time." They rode the rest of the way back to her homestead in a silence that felt, for the first time, entirely comfortable between them, and when they arrived, Walter helped her down from her horse with careful hands and did not immediately let go. "Mary," he said, and his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "I have been patient because I did not want to rush you into feeling something you were not ready to feel. But I love you. I have loved you, I think, since that first night in the rain, when you told me straight to my face that you did not trust cowboys, and I thought I had never in my life met a woman with more spirit or more sense. I would be honored, more than I know how to say, if you would consider becoming my wife." Mary stared at him, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it, and felt every guarded, careful wall she had built collapse at once, not with the violence of the barn fire but with the quiet, inevitable grace of spring ice breaking on the creek. "Yes," she said, and then, because the word seemed too small for what she felt, she said it again. "Yes, Walter, I will marry you. I love you too. I think I have for longer than I dared admit, even to myself." He kissed her then, gently, his hands framing her soot-smudged face with a tenderness that undid whatever remained of her composure, and Mary Dugan, standing in the ashes of a burned barn with the wreckage of her old fears scattered around her, understood with sudden, complete certainty that she had never in her life felt so entirely, so wonderfully safe. They were married in June, in the small, leaning steepled church in Prairie Bend, with Hattie Sullivan weeping happily in the front pew and half the county in attendance, drawn as much by curiosity about the fire and the confrontation with Whitfield as by genuine affection for the couple. Though by the time the ceremony ended, Mary suspected there was no one left in the building who did not wish them well from the bottom of their heart. Mary wore a dress of pale blue muslin that she had sewn herself over 3 long evenings, trimmed with lace she had carried all the way from Kansas without quite knowing why, as though some part of her had always hoped, despite her vows and her careful guardedness, that she might someday have a reason to wear it. Walter wore a new coat, stiff and unfamiliar on his broad shoulders, his hair combed flat in a way that made Hattie laugh aloud when she saw him, and stood at the front of the small church with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Mary felt her own eyes fill with tears before the Reverend had even begun to speak. "Do you, Walter Merritt, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" the Reverend intoned. "To have and to hold in sickness and in health, forsaking all others so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Walter said, his voice steady and clear, his eyes never once leaving Mary's face. "And do you, Mary Dugan, take this man to be your lawful husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live?" Mary thought in that moment of her mother's grave in Kansas, of the promise she had made there 10 years before, and understood at last that some vows are meant to be broken, when life proves them wrong with enough patience and enough love. "I do," she said, and the words came out steady, certain, and entirely without regret. They were pronounced man and wife to the sound of cheering that shook the little church's rafters, and outside, the whole town gathered for a wedding supper that stretched long into the warm summer evening, with fiddle music and dancing and more pie than even the harvest supper had managed to produce. Bartholomew Whitfield was not among the guests, having quietly sold off a portion of his herd and relocated his operations to a ranch near Cheyenne not long after the confrontation at his porch. Unwilling, it was said, to remain in a county where his reputation had been so thoroughly and publicly damaged. Mary felt no great satisfaction in his departure, only a quiet relief that the shadow he had cast over her homestead was finally, fully lifted. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for the Wyoming Territory was rarely gentle with those who tried to build a life upon it. There were droughts that browned the pastures and hard winters that tested every fence and every nerve. There were sick cattle and broken wagon wheels, and the ordinary difficulties of 2 proud people learning to share a single small life together. But there was also always the steady foundation Mary and Walter had built between them, brick by brick, promise by promise, until the doubts she had carried from her childhood seemed, at last, like memories from another woman's life entirely. They rebuilt the barn together that first summer, stronger and larger than before, and Walter's skill with cattle combined with Mary's sharp business sense to grow their small homestead into a modest but genuinely prosperous ranch over the following years. Mary opened a small dressmaking business out of a room in their expanded cabin, sewing gowns and mending shirts for half the women in Prairie Bend, and found in the work not just income but genuine joy, the satisfaction of a skill well used and well appreciated. In the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years after their wedding, Mary gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas, after her father with dark hair like his father's, and a stubborn set to his jaw that Hattie declared, laughing, was pure Dugan through and through. Walter held the infant in his big, careful hands on the porch of their cabin, tears standing openly in his eyes, and told Mary that he had never in his life imagined he could love anything so much, so instantly, so completely. "You said the same thing to me once," Mary reminded him, exhausted but glowing with happiness from the childbed. "The night you proposed." "I meant it then," Walter said, "and I mean it doubly now for both of you." 2 years later came their daughter, whom they named Sarah after the aunt whose homestead had brought Mary West in the first place. A bright, laughing child who grew up chasing chickens across the yard and riding before the saddle horn with her father almost before she could properly walk. 2 more children followed in the years after, a second son named Elias after Walter's own father, and a youngest daughter named Hattie, in honor of the woman who had become, in every way but blood, a second mother to Mary in her new home. The Bar M Ranch, where Walter had once worked as foreman, eventually passed into new ownership when its aging proprietor retired east to live with his daughter. And Walter, with Mary's full support and considerable financial planning of her own devising, purchased a good portion of its grazing land to add to their own growing operation, until the Merritt Ranch became one of the most respected and successful spreads in the county. Known as much for the fairness with which Walter treated his hired hands as for the quality of his cattle. Mary Dugan Merritt became, over the years, something of a fixture in Prairie Bend, respected for her business sense, her sharp wit, and the quiet steel that had once made her stand her ground against a wealthy cattleman on his own porch. She never entirely lost the caution that had shaped her youth, but she learned, through 15 years and more of marriage to Walter Merritt, that caution and love were not enemies, that a person could hold both wisdom and trust in the same open hand. On a warm evening in the autumn of 1893, with 4 children grown or nearly grown around them, and grandchildren beginning to make their own appearances at the family table, Mary sat on the porch of the ranch house she and Walter had built together, watching the sun set gold and orange over pastures thick with well-fed cattle, and found her husband's hand, weathered now and creased with the years, seeking out her on the way it always had. "Do you remember," she said, "what I told you the very first night we met, in the rain at that line shack?" "I remember every word," Walter said, smiling. "You told me you had been raised to never trust a cowboy." "And do you remember what you said back to me?" "I told you I would not ask you to trust me, only to get out of the rain." Mary laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light faded over the mountains, the sound of their children's voices drifting up from the yard below where the youngest, Hattie, now nearly grown herself, was teaching her own small niece to ride a gentle old mare. "I have never once regretted it," Mary said. "Not one single day in all these years. I married a cowboy, Walter Merritt, against every warning I was ever given, and it was the finest, wisest thing I have ever done." Walter turned his head and kissed her softly, there in the fading light, with the whole life they had built together spread out before them in every direction, cattle and children and hard-won land, and Mary Dugan, who had once sworn at her mother's grave never to trust a man like him, understood at last that some promises are worth breaking, when love proves patient enough and honest enough and true enough to earn it. "Nor have I," Walter murmured against her hair. "Not for one single moment." And there, on the porch of the home they had built from ashes and stubbornness and slow, careful trust, with the Wyoming sky burning gold above them, and their children's laughter rising from the yard, Mary and Walter Merritt sat together as they always had and always would, two hearts that had once been strangers in a storm, now bound as surely and completely as the land itself, weathered by hardship, deepened by time, and never, not for one single day, regretted.